If you've been paying any attention to far-right discourse over the last couple of years, you've probably noticed that they are very interested in talking about innate biological differences between races. These ideas have been showing up in videos and articles under some new names: human biodiversity, race realism, racialism, scientific racism, and social Darwinism. The most controversial aspect of this topic, and the one with the most salience today, has been that of inherent intelligence differences between different races, with the two that have been the most commonly compared being white and black people. This topic has emerged as a point of discussion within the intellectual dark web and the alt-right. In the intellectual dark web, we've seen Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talking about these ideas, specifically as they relate to the controversial book, The Bell Curve. And then over in the alt-right, you've got Stefan Molyneux and Richard Spencer openly advocating for a white ethno-state on the basis of white supremacy. What should concern those of us that are not members of these particular political subcultures is that these ideas are worming their way into mainstream discourse.
I think some people are not willing to look at genetics if it shows an unfavorable trait in minorities. They don't want to look at it. Obviously, a lot of factors that lead to IQ, to high IQ, but to ignore what those are, to ignore it completely, to just bury your head in the sand.
In the name of ideology, of course.
Yes, exactly. Only ideology. And this idea that you cannot look at statistics, you cannot look at facts.
That claim that he made there, that these ideas are being avoided as a matter of political correctness or ideological orthodoxy, have also been repeated by Harris and Peterson. And what's missing from their discussion of this is what their point is. They're really concerned with their ability to ask these questions, but it doesn't seem like they at all care what someone might do with the answers. So for the sake of argument, let's imagine that there was some groundbreaking study released that proved that there was an inherent difference in intelligence between different racial groups, and that this was caused by genetics. What could someone do with that information? The most charitable usage of this information would be to provide extra societal and educational support to these groups. That's totally a goal I can agree with, but we don't need this study to justify that, or any kind of genetic explanation. There's already plenty of studies out there that show that ethnic minorities need more from society than they've historically gotten. But overwhelmingly, the consensus is that this is due to social and economic factors. We don't need a biological explanation to justify that, because the outcome data, test scores and graduation rates, for example, are self-evident, and the solutions would be the same in either case. But that's just a hypothetical. The idea that there's some inherent intelligence difference between racial groups is not new. So what that means is that we can look at how societies in the past made use of a biological explanation and what they believe that justified. So let's look at the big four. Most people know that slavery apologists made up a bunch of dumb shit to try to justify slavery. But what might surprise you is the specificity of some of those absurd claims. Christoph Meiners was an 18th century historian and philosopher, whose ideas were later incorporated into the ideology of the Nazis. He wrote, in the Outline of the History of Mankind, that Africans felt less pain than other races due to their thick nerves, and that they lacked emotions. Thomas Jefferson, founding father and slave owner, said of Africans, "Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous." Also from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, it will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying, by importation of white settlers, the vacancies they will leave? Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties, and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race. So first of all, it sounds like Virginia was in quite a fucking state, dude. Second, this is an idea that you can see echoed in white supremacist circles to this day, and their explanation for why there's some inevitable white-black race war coming have not evolved very much in the 250 years since Jefferson wrote that. Phrenology was the scientific concept that you could measure someone's moral character and intelligence by the size and shape of their skull. And by coincidence, of course, phrenology proved that Northern Europeans were the most moral and intelligent, and Aborigines and Sub-Saharan Africans the least. Samuel Cartwright, a physician, proposed the idea that the attempts of enslaved peoples to escape from their bondage could be attributed to a mental disorder called drapetomania, and that this could be cured with proper medical advice, strictly followed. This troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented. These beliefs, tentatively grounded in early rational science, that Africans were inherently less intelligent and less capable or incapable of experiencing pain, was used to justify the institution of slavery in the United States. And they were also used to justify European colonialism abroad, under the premise that the more developed races had either the right or the responsibility to dominate all others. And by the way, we're not over this yet in America. According to a 2016 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites, beliefs dating back to slavery, are associated with the perception that black people feel less pain than do white people, and with inadequate treatment recommendations for black patients' pain. Following the end of the Civil War and the consequent abolition of slavery, justifications for preserving the strictly enforced social positions of whites versus blacks became a major point of concern for the white men in power. Numerous studies were produced that claimed to prove inherent racial differences in intelligence. These were used to justify segregation in schools, and in the 1908 Supreme Court case Berea College versus Kentucky, in which the Supreme Court upheld a segregationist policy, prohibiting schools from teaching both white and black students in the same facilities. In this case, the Attorney General of Kentucky, James Breathitt, quoted an eminent writer on natural selection, William Benjamin Smith, author of The Color Line, as follows. The notion of social racial equality is abhorrent alike to instinct and to reason. It is idle to talk of education and civilization and the like, as corrective or compensative agencies. All are weak and beggarly as over against the almightiness of heredity, the omnipotence of the transmitted germ plasma. Breathitt also stated in the case that he believed science had proved an innate difference in mental capacity between blacks and whites, and that education, culture, refinement, and civilization are the result of the polishing of the inborn and God-given faculty. Training, culture, and education never produce faculty. Just 2 years after this case, Baltimore would pass a comprehensive racial zoning ordinance, which restricted the ability of whites and blacks to live in the same neighborhood, and a dozen other major U.S. cities would pass similar ordinances over the next decade. These separation policies were not meant to divide the races just to uphold existing social stratification. A major concern for the proponents of race science was that of miscegenation, or race mixing, and the dangers that they believed that posed to the health of society. In 1918, the widely influential textbook Applied Eugenics described the dangers of miscegenation. The innate hereditary mental shortcomings of black people would be passed on to their offspring, and then thereby weigh down white society. Segregation was then, in their minds, a natural preventative measure to prevent contact between the races, especially in the spaces where people are young and most likely to develop romantic attraction, such as schools or colleges. Based on beliefs like this, interracial marriage had been nearly universally outlawed in the South since the 1800s, and it was also prohibited in several northern and western states as well. The eugenics project of this time did not exclusively consist of these preventative legal prohibitions. Based on the belief that the well-being of society depended on preventing bad genetics from being spread, forced and coerced sterilizations of minorities were employed throughout the early 1900s. And these efforts in the United States were lauded by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. In Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler wrote, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of citizenship are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." And here we reach the grimmest of history's lessons on this subject. American scientific writers and science-inspired policies served as a template for the infamous Nazi eugenics programs. The Nazi programs, which I think require no specific description here, use the same types of pseudo-scientific arguments which I've just described to justify and inform their plans for a genocide that would be a permanent scar on the face of humanity. In 1950, the United Nations would release a statement called the Race Question. In it they said, The importance which the problem of race has acquired in the modern world scarcely needs to be pointed out. Mankind will not soon forget the injustices and crimes which gave such tragic overtones to the word race. The great and terrible war which has now ended was a war made possible by the denial of the democratic principles of the dignity, equality, and mutual respect of men, and by propagation, in their place, through ignorance and prejudice, of the doctrine of the inequality of men and races. This is not to say that any discussion of the possibility of a genetic intelligence correlation will automatically and inevitably lead down the slippery slope toward genocide. But in law, life, and a healthy worldview, precedent matters. And the precedent here clearly indicates that there is nothing worth revisiting in the ideologies that helped to write these darkest chapters of human history. And even tentative invocations of these ideologies should be viewed with an extremely suspicious and critical eye. Many others have argued that the definitions of the primary correlating factors in question here, race and intelligence, are not well enough defined in a scientific sense to be useful in this context. And others have already done a great job of laying out the specific methodological issues with the science at hand. I'll link to some of those in the description because I think that many others have said it better than I can. But to briefly summarize some of those points, let's ask ourselves. As much as some people like to act like race is a clear-cut category, putting any thought into that question quickly dispels that illusion. Is race just skin color? Is it ancestry? Which race do people of mixed heritages belong to? At what percentage of ancestry does someone switch over from being one race to another? Is it purely genetic, or is it a social construct? Even within the same field, scientists and researchers are not in agreement on a strict definition, and across fields, that inconsistency is magnified. If you ask a white nationalist, please don't ask a white nationalist, they'll tell you that whiteness could be erased by as little as one drop of non-white ancestral blood. But even they can't agree all the way. Although IQ gives us a quick and easy number by which we can ostensibly determine the mental capacity of someone, it's been widely criticized as an actual measure of the overall intelligence of a human being, especially in that it has no measure of social or artistic intelligence. And with IQ providing an incomplete picture of intelligence, we are forced to deal with the fact that intelligence in general is a nebulous concept, with no agreement within the scientific or lay community on exactly what aspects it encompasses. For example, here's what you get if you try to look for a definition on Wikipedia. Herbert Hovkamp, writer of Social Science and Segregation Before Brown, summarized this issue nicely. Intelligence, after all, must be measured instrumentally. Useful intelligence is the ability of an organism to solve the problems that its environment presents. Each culture is adapted to its own environment, and each must have its own standards for intelligence. We perpetuate racist stereotypes when we give one culture an intelligence test designed for the members of a different culture. They invariably perform poorly. We then have proof that blacks or Indians or members of some other racial minority are inferior to the Caucasians who have been supplying the tests all along. So what happens when you take two poorly defined concepts and try to use correlations between them to generate policy based on existing prejudices? Well, unsurprisingly, prejudices are validated, the vulnerable are harmed, and those interested in the legitimate exercise of science and the preservation of human dignity and equality are forced to work overtime to question and then finally discredit the pseudoscience. The history of scientific racism shows this cycle run over and over, and here it goes again. And when I say this stuff is pseudoscience, I'm not saying that as a slur for science that contradicts my fifis. Pseudoscience is what each of the previous examples of race science have been proven to be. And this is because in each case, the people trying to do this science failed to leave their prejudices at the door and tried to use biased observation to shape policy. And in many cases, the people researching these questions have no business making specific claims about a connection between intelligence and genetics. Charles Murray, the bell curve guy, is a political scientist. William Benjamin Smith, the author of The Color Line, was a mathematician. Christoph Meiners was a historian, and Thomas Jefferson was a philosopher, a lawyer, oh yeah, and he owned over 600 slaves. That's not to say that researchers need to stay in their own lanes exclusively, but when people with actual expertise in these fields question their methods and findings, then maybe they should take the hint. Even in our more modern examples, even though scientific rigor has improved since the time of Miners and Jefferson, not much has changed as far as justifying why this research is worthwhile in the first place. In 2005, J. Philippe Rushton and Arthur R. Jensen published in the APA's publication Psychology, Public Policy and Law an article named Wanted, More Race Realism, Less Moralistic Fallacy. Near the end of this long screed trying once again to use IQ to justify scientific racism, they ask the same question that I asked earlier in this video. What good is this kind of research supposed to achieve? Their response: this is worth discussing if only because we will never make progress in race relations if we operate on the belief that one segment of society is responsible for the plight of another segment, and that belief is false. And here we can find what is really at the core of this modern resurgence of racial science: absolving white people of the sins of the past. After all, if they can prove that some races are biologically destined to be less intelligent, that it isn't slavery, segregation, eugenics, and racism that have caused the disadvantaged position of black people in American society, it is simply a natural consequence of a genetic lack of intelligence. I don't think Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris are trying to use scientific racism to find a reason to start segregation or slavery back up. I think they're looking for an explanation that they can accept for the disadvantaged position of black people within American society. They are unwilling to face the obvious fact that this disadvantage is due to racism and the long history of brutal oppression. So they are seeking, for lack of a better word, absolution. Not just for themselves personally, but for all white people everywhere.
I'm innocent! It's not my fault!
These aren't noble pursuits. They're cynical and hollow excuses for the cruel systems that dead men designed long ago. In the very next paragraph after that last quote, Rushton and Jensen move on to relitigating Brown versus the Board of Education, arguing that the Supreme Court's majority decision was based on faulty science and political correctness. Is that it? Is the best policy you could come up with from your pseudoscientific crusade really the return of noted good idea, segregation? To summarize, even if we were able to come up with some definitive conclusions about a correlation between race and intelligence, the only precedents that we have on how to act on this information are clearly harmful and dangerous. The tiny silver lining of any possible positive uses of that information, things like improving health outcomes, is made completely redundant by countless existing studies on this subject that account for environmental and other factors. And I am far from convinced that we could reach any definite conclusions at all, due to the fuzziness of the concepts at hand and the very real possibility of prejudice skewing the results. Race realism, or whatever euphemism you want to use, is not a worthwhile endeavor. It's irredeemable unless you're someone that thinks that segregation, eugenics, and genocide are potentially good ideas. Or you're trying to justify your own racism as a consequence of natural forces. I would like to end here with a section from a biographical article about Charles Murray. In the fall of 1960, during Murray's senior year of high school, he and a group of friends nailed scrap wood together to build a cross. They then covered it in fireworks, and then set it ablaze on a hill beside the town police station. This was in a small town with only 2 black families. Charles' reaction to being reminded of that event many years later was this: there wouldn't have been a racist thought in our simple-minded minds. That's how unaware we were. It never crossed our minds that this had any larger significance. And I look back on that and say, how on earth could we be so oblivious? I guess it says something about that day and age that it didn't cross our minds. Thanks for watching my first video. I hope you liked it. Please leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and subscribe if you want to see what I'm up to next. Hopefully, real soon.